Okay, so I'm excited about the comic book space, and I honestly think you should be too. I watched a live with Eric July yesterday, and he had this artist on here on his podcast. I believe her name is Rennie. Forgive me if I'm mispronouncing that name. I'm always terrible with names. Okay, so here's what I'm thinking. The comic book space is in a comeback season. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, what do you mean comeback season? Comics have been at a lull for so long, and they've, in so many ways, just neglected their fans altogether. But I say to you, this is the exciting part. Whenever you have a market, and look, I'm no strategist, I'm no big market guy. I'm not proclaiming to you that I understand the ins and outs of markets and how they work. But this one thing I do know, when you have a certain segment of the market that neglects their customers, then what tends to happen is you have another section of that market that sees that neglect as opportunity because there are people who are underserved. I don't know if you remember what happened with Netflix. So Netflix was doing something that Blockbuster really they could have competed with, and I think at one point they tried to, but I think they tried too late. This is what Blockbuster saw. This is what Netflix saw. There are certain areas where you don't really have Blockbuster, or people just don't want to leave their house. They don't want to travel to Blockbuster, but they want to rent a movie. Why should they have to go to a place to rent this movie? Blockbuster should be able to send this movie to the people so that they don't even have to leave their houses. Now, you might say that's lazy. Okay, but here's the thing. Where the average person might see laziness, and you could say to some degree it's lazy on the part of consumers. But what Netflix saw was an opportunity to reach people who are underserved, people who just decided, you know what, I really don't want to travel to go to Blockbuster. I don't want to set up a Blockbuster account, but I can do this from my couch. Now, how did this happen? Well, Netflix came about during, I would say, the internet boom, right? High-speed internet was becoming a thing more and more. And, people were doing more things online. And again, another area Netflix capitalized on, streaming. They caught on to this really early. Now, of course, just because you're first to the race doesn't mean you're going to win. And there's other streaming services that have better offerings than Netflix right now for sure. But you see what I mean? These areas where consumers, fans were underserved, somebody swooped in and picked up that loose change. Now, in reference to comic books, this is what you have. You have people in droves moving to manga. You have people in droves moving to things that are just outside the sphere of comic books. But where a lot of people see the giants in the comic book space in some ways neglecting fans, and they see that as an end to comic books, I say that what we are seeing is one of the greatest opportunities in comic book history for independent creators. And I think that's bearing out. You have people like Ethan Van Sciver with Cyberfrog. Of course, we've talked about ISOM. There's other books that people are working on. These might be some of the most well-known independent comic books, but there's a lot of independent ventures people are working on that I think they're going to fill the gap. And I think what has happened is there's more and more attention being driven to these independent creators. So what I see is this is the resurgence of comic books. I think we are on the verge of seeing comic books return to prominence. Now, does that mean comic books are going to be what they once were? They may not be. Comic books may never return to exactly what we're used to. But I do believe we're going to see something that's very unique, and comic books are probably going to make a comeback in the generations to come. This is like part of Americana, comic books, right? This is just it's hard. It's when I think about the inception of the United States, there's several things that come to mind, but comic books are one of those things, right? Comic books, apple pie, baseball, basketball, football. These are things, barbecue, cookouts. These are things that just scream America. And now look, comic books are worldwide. I understand that. I'm speaking merely from the perspective of someone in the United States, but also understanding that the comic book audience is now international. And so the internet has really opened up the world. And in some ways, it has made the world a smaller place, which is actually a great opportunity for independent creators. So I think comic books are going to make a return. And I think competition is another thing. I'm excited, actually. I think competition is going to make the big content houses, is going to force them to compete. They're going to have to come to the table and compete at a level they didn't have to compete before, because it was just, I would say, probably the big 4 or 5 comic book houses, IDW, what's the other one? I always forget. Dark Horse, DC, Marvel, and Image. I think those are the top 5 content houses. And when you have 5 content houses to serve, however many millions of comic book fans you have, that's really not a bunch of companies. But what you have now with all of these independent creators, they're pushing the envelope. But kind of like technology. When BlackBerry ruled cell phones and, smartphones, I guess you can consider a BlackBerry a smartphone, sort of. They didn't really have much competition. I mean, the Sidekick was out and it was doing this thing. But when the iPhone came along, as much hate as the iPhone got, the original iPhone actually pushed the other cell phone companies to step their game up. That competition made things better for everybody, including the consumer. So this is the same thing I see happening in the comic book space. I really think that the comic book space is going to come back, but it may look different. It may be that DC, Marvel, and all these other big content houses have to concede that, okay, these independent creators have now gained some ground. And what can we do about this? Well, all we can do is now compete at a high level. We need good art, good stories. We're not going to be able to just sell an agenda. We actually need to compete on an artistic level. So I want to go to this creator, Rennie, and she has some really good art, in my opinion. And she has her fantasy series called Fiendish. I think this is actually pretty good. So this is her one of her websites, Rennie Draws, and I also got up her Fiendish comic website. It says Fiendish is an independent fantasy comic by Irene Strakowski. So I guess that's her actual name, that merges influences from manga, mystery storytelling, classic fantasy, and and Lovecraftian horror. I don't really know much about that. This is really not my thing, so I'm pretty sure I'm slaughtering a bunch of this stuff. Okay. After mysterious demons killed their respective families, Casimir, Yaomi, and Ishkal set out to discover the truth behind the monsters. However, the burdens of the past weigh heavily as the small group of outcasts venture forth. With action, horror, magic, and mystery alike, Fiendish aims to spin for you a tale of vengeance and redemption like never seen before. And right here, you see some of the fiendish art. Yeah, and it really does look like manga. I would imagine that this is the influence she grew up under. So, of course, whatever your influence is, this is what you're going to gravitate towards. So it looks good. Her art looks good. And I'm, looking at some of the panels on the comic book. I'm very impressed. She's been, I think she said she started to draw when she was really young, like I think 13 or something like that. I don't know exactly how old she is, but I think she says she's been at this for 10 years, if I'm not mistaken. She seemed pretty young, and seemed like she had a very good head on her shoulders. And though this might not necessarily be my type of content as far as comic books, to me, this says that the American comic book artists, both artists and storyteller, writers, pencilers, inkers, they've not given up. They've not just ridden off into the sunset and said, oh, well, that's it. I guess we can't create anything. So that to me is exciting. That tells me that the industry as a whole still has legs. And though we might be in a downturn and things may not be the greatest with some of the comic books that we all grew up with and loved, there's some new things in the horizon. Just like anything else, you may have some old things collapse. You may have some old things being dilapidated, falling apart. But typically somebody new comes along and offers you something that you didn't have before. And I think that's what's going on. That actually makes me excited. So here's her fiendish website. She has renniedraws.com and fiendishcomic.com. And, you can look through some of her panels, some of her art. It does remind me a lot of manga. Like I said, this is obviously where her influence has come from. But good art. Very good art. If manga was more my speed, I would probably definitely pick this up. And who knows? I think I might, just to support her and her content creation, I might buy one of these books. I don't know much about it, but I might look into it and I might, throw some money in a pot and buy this, because it's got to be very exciting to have started drawing. I know it is, because when I used to draw, if I would have been able to create my own comic book and actually put it out, it would have been such a great feeling of accomplishment. So I can imagine that she feels super accomplished, starting out her artistic career and getting to this point, putting in that 10,000 hours and getting to the point where she can put a book together. And I think there's a lot of artists just like her out there putting stuff together. And look, there's also veterans who are leaving the traditional comic book space and going an independent route. And I think these people are putting out some very good books. So don't be discouraged. If you enjoy comic books, if you grew up with comic books and you're worried about comic books, going the way of some other things and just not existing anymore, I would not concern myself with that. I think comic books are really due in a different way to make a huge comeback with some exciting work.